When I speak of the moment the empath becomes unreachable, I am not referring to a dramatic gesture, nor to a conscious decision formed in the daylight mind. I am speaking of a psychic event, quiet in its arrival, immense in its consequences. It is a turning of the inner axis, a shift in the gravitational center of the soul. Those who live by attunement to others often believe change must announce itself loudly, with confrontation or explanation, yet the psyche does not transform in that way. It transforms as the seasons do. One morning you notice the air is different, and you cannot return to the climate you inhabited before. You, who have lived as an empath, have long mistaken permeability for virtue. You learned early that to survive was to feel the moods of the room before words were spoken, to anticipate disappointment before it arrived, to soften yourself so that others might remain whole. This sensitivity did not arise from generosity alone, it arose from necessity. The child who learns to read emotional weather does so because storms are dangerous. Over time, what began as an instinct becomes an identity. You do not merely feel others, you become a place where others deposit what they cannot bear. In analysis, I saw many such souls. They came burdened not by their own conflicts, but by the unlived lives of those around them. They carried fathers who never wept, mothers who never rested, lovers who never matured, and they called this love, they called it loyalty, they called it goodness, yet the unconscious has its own accounting, and it does not accept false currencies indefinitely. The moment of becoming unreachable does not occur when you decide to withdraw. It occurs when the unconscious withdraws its permission. Something in you says, without words, no more. This is not rebellion, it is not bitterness, it is the psyche correcting an imbalance that has gone on too long. When energy has flowed outward for decades without return, the inner world begins to close its gates, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. You may notice this first as fatigue that sleep does not cure, or as irritation toward requests that once felt natural, or as a strange silence inside when others speak of their troubles. You listen, but the old reflex to merge does not arise. This absence troubles you at first. You fear you are becoming cold, or selfish, or damaged, but in truth, something far older and wiser has begun to speak, the instinct of individuation. Individuation is not a moral process. It does not care whether you appear kind. It cares only that you become whole. For the empath, wholeness requires the withdrawal of projections. Others have projected onto you the archetype of the container, the healer, the ever-present witness. You accepted these projections because they gave you belonging, but projections are thefts of reality. They rob both sides of truth. When they begin to fall away, the world reacts with confusion, even hostility. This is why everything flips. Those who relied on your accessibility feel an unnamed anxiety. They cannot articulate it, but they sense a loss of control. You are no longer immediately reachable in the psychic sense. They speak, and you do not rearrange yourself to accommodate. They suffer, and you do not rush to dissolve the pain. This does not mean you lack compassion. It means compassion has ceased to be compulsive. It has become conscious. In dreams, this shift often appears as a door that no longer opens, a phone that rings but is not answered, a house whose rooms are suddenly locked. The dream ego is disturbed by this. Why can I not enter? It asks. But the dream is announcing a boundary that has finally been erected, where there was once no separation between inner and outer. A threshold now stands. The shadow plays a crucial role here. For the empath, the shadow often contains aggression, refusal, indifference, even cruelty, not because these qualities are dominant, but because they were forbidden. You learn that anger endangered attachment, that saying no invited abandonment. These instincts were pushed into darkness, yet the psyche cannot remain one-sided. What is repressed does not disappear, it waits. When the empath becomes unreachable, it is often the shadow that guards the gate, not in its raw, destructive form, but in a refined one. You may feel a quiet firmness, an unmovable center. You do not argue, you do not justify, you simply do not move toward what once consumed you. This is deeply unsettling to those who knew how to pull your strings. They will escalate, they will accuse, they will appeal to your former self, but something essential has already changed. I must emphasize, this is not an act of willpower. If it were, it would collapse under guilt. This is an instinctual reorganization. The libido, the psychic energy, has turned inward, where it once flowed outward toward repair, appeasement, and emotional labor. It now begins to nourish the neglected inner world. Symbols are recur, memories surface, old dreams return. You may feel disoriented, as though a familiar map no longer applies. That is because it does not. In alchemical language, this is the nigredo, the darkening. The old identity dissolves. The empath, who was defined by availability, enters a kind of inner night. Others misinterpret this as withdrawal or depression. But inwardly, something is forming. The self, which has long been obscured by adaptations, begins to assert itself. You will notice that explanations lose their appeal. You once believed that if others understood your feelings, harmony would return, but now you sense the futility of explanation, where the listener is invested in your role, not your reality. Silence becomes more truthful than speech. Distance becomes more honest than closeness maintained by self-betrayal. This is the point at which many feel fear. They ask, if I am not needed, who am I? This is the central terror of the empath. Their worth has been mirrored back to them through usefulness. When that mirror shatters, there is a moment of nothingness. Yet this void is not emptiness. It is potential. It is the space in which a new relation to the world can be formed. Those around you will say you have changed. They are correct, but they will mean it as an accusation. Change threatens the unconscious contracts that bind relationships. You were predictable. You were reachable. Now you are not, and unpredictability awakens anxiety in those who depend on stable patterns of extraction. Do not mistake their distress for your responsibility. At this stage, the archetype of the hermit often becomes active, not necessarily in physical isolation, but in psychic withdrawal. You may find yourself less interested in explaining your inner life. You conserve energy. You choose where to engage. This is not numbness. It is discernment. The empath who becomes unreachable has not lost feeling. they have regained sovereignty. In the collective, such a shift is poorly understood. Cultures that prize self-sacrifice often punish those who individuate, yet the psyche answers to deeper laws than social approval. It answers to balance, and balance demands that what has been given away unconsciously must now be reclaimed consciously. This is only the beginning. The first phase is marked by confusion, guilt, and a strange calm that coexists with grief. You mourn the self you were, even as you cannot return to it. You sense that a door has closed behind you. Ahead, the path is not yet visible, but the direction is irreversible. The empath becomes unreachable not to punish the world, but to finally hear their own soul speak without interruption, and once that voice is heard, the old arrangements can never fully resume. Let us pause here, at the threshold of this transformation, before we move deeper into what follows when the world realizes you are no longer available in the way it once assumed. As this inward turning continues, you may notice that the world does not immediately adjust. The psyche moves first, reality follows slowly, often with resistance. Others will continue to approach you as if nothing has changed, as if the old pathways are still open. They speak in familiar tones, invoke shared history, rely on your reflexive availability. At first, you may feel a strange lag between their expectations and your inner response. Where once there was immediacy, there is now a pause. In that pause, something decisive happens. This pause is not emptiness, it is awareness. For the first time, you experience the interval between stimulus and response as a living space. Previously, that space was collapsed. Feeling flowed directly into action. Need was answered before it was even articulated. Now, the pause expands, and within it you begin to sense yourself as a separate psychic fact. This separation is the true beginning of autonomy. In analytic terms, we might say that the ego has ceased to be flooded by the complexes of others. For many empaths, the dominant complex is relational. The fear of abandonment, the need to maintain harmony, the compulsion to repair. These forces once ruled the ego like invisible gods, but when the unconscious withdraws its energy from these patterns, the gods fall silent. You are left alone with yourself, and this solitude feels both frightening and strangely clean. It is at this point that old guilt often resurfaces with particular intensity. Not new guilt, but ancient guilt, the kind that does not belong to any specific act. It is the guilt of having needs, the guilt of existing as a separate center of gravity. You may hear inner voices that sound suspiciously like those who once depended on you. Subtle accusations, moral appeals, reminders of who you used to be. These voices are not external, though they wear familiar masks. They are internalized figures, lodged in the psyche long ago. If you listen carefully, you will notice that these voices do not ask whether you are alive, or truthful, or whole. They ask only whether you are still useful. This is a crucial distinction. Usefulness is not the same as meaning. The psyche seeks meaning, not utility. When you choose meaning, usefulness may diminish, and the psyche accepts this without regret. Dreams at this stage often grow more symbolic and less relational. Instead of scenes filled with people and emotional entanglements, You may dream of landscapes, ruins, mountains, deserts, oceans. The human figures recede, and the archetypal world advances. This signals a shift from personal drama to transpersonal process. Your soul is no longer preoccupied with managing relationships. It is engaged in a conversation with something deeper. You may dream of walking alone through unfamiliar terrain, not afraid, but alert, or of discovering a hidden room in a familiar house, one that was always there but never entered. Such dreams are not invitations to return to others, but invitations to inhabit yourself. They indicate that psychic energy is being reclaimed from the outer world and reinvested in inner exploration. Externally, this inner reorganization appears as distance. People describe you as changed, distracted, unavailable. They may accuse you of withholding, of becoming selfish, of withdrawing love, but love that requires self-erasure is not love. It is a transaction rooted in fear. What is being withdrawn is not love, but compulsion. Here the shadow again demands attention. As you become unreachable, qualities you once disowned begin to surface with greater clarity. You may feel anger without justification, firmness without apology, disinterest without guilt. These feelings may surprise you, even alarm you, but they are not signs of moral decay. They are signs of psychic balance being restored. The shadow, when integrated, does not turn the empath into a tyrant. It gives them weight. It gives their yes and no equal gravity. Without shadow, kindness is fragile and easily exploited. With shadow, kindness becomes a choice rather than a reflex. This is why the empath's transformation feels so disruptive to others. They sense that your kindness now has conditions, and conditions introduce uncertainty. Uncertainty is intolerable to those who rely on predictability for control. As your reachability diminishes, something else becomes visible: the asymmetry of many relationships. You begin to notice how often you listened without being heard, how often you gave without receiving, how often your presence was taken for granted. This awareness is not bitter, but it is sobering. It strips illusion from memory. You see clearly that many bonds were sustained not by mutual recognition, but by your willingness to bend. This recognition often brings grief, not the dramatic grief of loss, but the quiet grief of realization. You grieve the time given without reciprocity, the self postponed, the questions never asked because they would have disrupted peace. This grief is necessary. It clears the ground for a more truthful orientation toward others. At this juncture, the temptation to explain yourself may arise again, but in a subtler form. You may want to justify your distance, to reassure others that you still care, to soften the impact of your withdrawal, yet something in you resists this. You sense that explanation would reopen the door you have just closed, not because explanation is wrong, but because it would once again place your inner process under external negotiation. The psyche does not negotiate its need for balance. Silence, therefore, becomes an act of fidelity to yourself, not cold silence, but contained silence. You speak when speech emerges from inner alignment, not from anxiety. You listen without absorbing. You are present without being porous. This is a new posture, and it takes time to inhabit it without oscillation. Do not expect immediate peace. The psyche rarely moves in straight lines. There will be moments when old habits reassert themselves, when guilt pierces the new boundaries, when you feel the urge to rescue or explain. These moments are not failures. They are residues. Patterns built over decades do not dissolve in a single season. What matters is not perfection, but direction. As this direction stabilizes, you may notice an unexpected phenomenon, a growing sense of inner authority, not dominance, not control over others, but a quiet certainty about where you stand. Decisions become simpler, not because life is easier, but because you no longer consult a chorus of internalized voices before acting. You consult yourself. This inner authority is often misunderstood. Others may interpret it as rigidity or detachment, but it is neither. It is alignment. When the ego aligns with the self, behavior becomes less reactive and more grounded. You do not need to convince. You do not need to perform. Your presence alone communicates a boundary that words once failed to establish. In mythological terms, this phase resembles the hero's withdrawal into the wilderness, not to escape the world, but to undergo transformation. The empath's wilderness is not geographic, it is relational. You step out of roles that defined you and enter a space where you are unknown. Even to yourself, this unknown is fertile. It is where new forms of relating will eventually emerge. For now, however, the task is containment, to hold this emerging self without offering it prematurely to others, to resist the impulse to translate inner change into outer reassurance. The psyche requires incubation. Just as a seed must remain underground before it breaks the surface, your transformation requires darkness and protection. When the empath becomes unreachable, the world experiences absence, but you experience presence, your own presence, and this presence, once felt, becomes non-negotiable. As this presence deepens, a subtle but decisive reversal takes place. What once moved automatically toward the outer world now begins to orient itself from within. You no longer scan the environment for cues about how to be, how to feel, how to respond. Instead, you sense first, internally, and only then allow the outer situation to meet you. This reversal is quiet, but it alters the entire economy of the psyche. In earlier phases of your life, the question guiding your behavior was rarely conscious. Yet it was always there. What is required of me here? That question shaped your posture, your tone, your availability. It made you adaptable, empathic, and reliable. It also made you disappear. Now a different question begins to arise, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes with startling clarity. What is true for me in this moment? This question is not moral. It does not ask what is right or kind in the abstract. It asks what is real, and reality, once contacted, is difficult to betray without consequence. When the empath becomes unreachable, others often feel as though an invisible agreement has been broken. They cannot name it, but they sense a rupture. The agreement was never spoken, yet it governed the relationship. You would be emotionally present, responsive, available, and in return, you would receive belonging, approval, or at least a sense of purpose. When you withdraw from this contract, the other party feels cheated, even if the terms were never explicit. This is why explanations rarely help. An explanation implies that the old contract is still valid and merely needs renegotiation. But what has occurred is not renegotiation. It is dissolution. The contract itself no longer corresponds to your psychic reality. To explain would be to pretend that the change is situational, when in fact it is structural. At this stage, many empaths experience a strange inversion of empathy itself. You may find that you understand others more clearly than before, yet feel less compelled to intervene. This can feel paradoxical, but empathy, when freed from compulsion, becomes perception rather than participation. You see suffering without immediately entering it. You recognize manipulation without needing to expose it. You sense need without rushing to fill it. This distance does not diminish understanding, it sharpens it. In dreams, this often appears as watching events unfold from a higher vantage point. You are present, but not entangled. Or you may dream of being invisible, moving through scenes without being noticed. Such images reflect the psyche's new position, engaged but not consumed. The unconscious is teaching you how to witness without absorption. Here, the archetype of the observer, or the wise old figure, begins to stir, not as an external authority, but as an inner stance. You become less interested in being liked and more interested in being aligned. This shift is often accompanied by a decrease in dramatic emotional highs and lows. The nervous system, long accustomed to constant vigilance, begins to settle. Calm emerges, not as relief, but as baseline. Yet calm can feel unsettling to those who equated intensity with connection. They may provoke, dramatize, or escalate in an attempt to re-establish the old emotional rhythm. When these attempts fail, their frustration grows. They may accuse you of being distant, cold, or changed for the worse. What they are responding to is not your lack of feeling, but your lack of availability to be regulated through. This is a crucial point. Many relationships are unconsciously organized around emotional regulation. One person contains, the other discharges. When the container steps away, the discharger must face their own psychic contents. This is often experienced as abandonment. Though no abandonment has occurred, what has occurred is a return of responsibility. The empath's unreachability forces others into confrontation with themselves. Some will respond by turning inward, perhaps for the first time. Others will seek a new container elsewhere. Still others will attack, attempting to shame you back into your former role. These reactions are diagnostic. They reveal what your presence was truly used for. Internally, this period can bring moments of profound loneliness, not the loneliness of being unloved, but the loneliness of being no longer mirrored. When you stop reflecting others, you may notice that few reflect you. This can be painful. It exposes how rarely your inner world was truly met. But it also clarifies something essential. You were never meant to be sustained solely by reflection from without. This loneliness is transitional. It belongs to the passage between identities. The psyche is shedding a skin, and for a time there is vulnerability. During this phase, the temptation to return to old patterns can be strong. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. But if you listen closely, you will notice that the old patterns no longer fully work. They drain you more quickly, they feel hollow. This is the psyche enforcing its new orientation. The concept of duty undergoes a transformation here. You begin to differentiate between responsibility and obligation. Responsibility arises from inner truth. Obligation arises from fear of consequence. Much of what you once carried was obligation disguised as virtue. As unreachability stabilizes, obligation loses its moral glow. You see it for what it is, a pressure to betray yourself in order to maintain external equilibrium. This does not mean you abandon responsibility. On the contrary, responsibility becomes more precise. You take responsibility for your inner state, your limits, your choices. You cease taking responsibility for emotions that are not yours. This distinction may seem subtle, but it redraws the boundaries of the self. Symbolically, this phase corresponds to the emergence of the inner axis. You are no longer oriented primarily horizontally toward others, but vertically between conscious ego and unconscious self. Decisions feel less negotiated and more anchored. You may not always know why something feels wrong or right, but the feeling carries authority. This is not intuition as impulse, it is intuition as alignment. Those who encounter you now may sense this verticality. They may feel strangely exposed, as though their usual strategies do not land. You are not reacting in expected ways. You are not pulled into familiar dances. This can feel threatening, but it can also feel oddly relieving. Some will experience your presence as stabilizing, even if they cannot explain why. These are often individuals who are ready to relate without extraction. As this phase unfolds, you may find that fewer relationships survive, but those that do change in quality. Conversations become simpler, more direct. Silence is no longer awkward. You are less inclined to fill space. When you speak, it is from necessity rather than habit. This economy of expression mirrors the economy of your inner life. Energy is conserved, not squandered. It is important to understand that becoming unreachable does not mean becoming isolated forever. It means that access is no longer automatic. Access is now earned through reciprocity, presence, and respect for boundaries. This selectivity is not defensive. It is discerning. It allows genuine encounter to replace compulsive connection. At a deeper level, the empath's unreachability marks a turning point in the individuation process. The ego has stopped confusing fusion with love. It has begun to tolerate separateness without panic. This tolerance is the foundation of mature relationship. Without it, connection remains regressive, driven by unmet childhood needs. You may feel, at times, as though you are standing on unfamiliar ground, watching the old world rearrange itself around you. This is accurate. The psychic center has shifted. The map you once used no longer applies, but something steadier has taken its place. A quiet gravity, an inner north. What follows from here is not a return to the old world, but a re-entry on different terms. The empath does not disappear. They reappear differently. And when they do, the rules of engagement have changed. Irrevocably, when re-entry begins, it does not announce itself. There is no moment where you decide to return to the world as someone new. Rather, the world begins to approach you differently, and you notice that you do not step forward to meet it in the old way. This difference is subtle but decisive. You are present, but you are not available for misuse. You are open, but not exposed. You have become reachable only where resonance exists. This is often when a strange calm settles into the body. Not relief, not joy, but a grounded stillness. The nervous system, once trained to remain alert for emotional shifts in others, no longer scans compulsively. You breathe more deeply without noticing. Your shoulders lower, your speech slows. These bodily changes are not cosmetic. They reflect a profound psychic realignment. The body always knows when the psyche has stopped betraying itself. At this stage, you may observe something quietly astonishing. People either rise to meet you or fall away without drama. There is less confrontation than you expected. The drama belonged to the old pattern, which required constant emotional exchange to sustain itself. When that exchange ends, many dynamics simply dissolve. Some relationships do not end with conflict, they fade, like habits that no longer serve the organism. Others, however, respond in a more revealing way. They test the boundary. They press gently at first, then with greater insistence. They may disguise their pressure as concern, nostalgia, or moral appeal. They speak of how close you used to be, how much you helped them, how they do not understand what changed. They hope to awaken guilt, because guilt was once the key that opened every door. But guilt now encounters something solid. You feel it arise, perhaps as a faint echo, but it no longer commands. You can observe it without obeying it. This is one of the most significant achievements of the empath's transformation. Guilt has shifted from authority to signal. It tells you that an old pattern is being activated, not that you must submit to it. Here, the psyche demonstrates a new kind of strength, the ability to disappoint without collapse. This capacity is not cruelty, it is differentiation. The child cannot tolerate disappointing the parent without fearing annihilation. The individuated adult can tolerate disappointment without confusing it with danger. When you disappoint others now, you remain intact. The world does not end. The relationship may change, but you do not disappear. This is a developmental milestone long delayed in the empath's life. As you inhabit this new position, the quality of your empathy changes again. It becomes quieter, more precise. You no longer feel compelled to rescue, but you can still perceive suffering with clarity. In fact, your perception deepens because it is no longer distorted by urgency. You can remain present with another's pain without attempting to erase it. This is a rare capacity. It allows genuine witnessing, which is far more transformative than intervention. You may notice that some people experience your presence as unsettling. They feel seen without being managed. There is no immediate soothing, no emotional cushioning. This can provoke anxiety in those accustomed to being regulated externally. Yet others experience your presence as profoundly stabilizing. They feel no pressure to perform or collapse. They sense that they are responsible for themselves, and strangely, this feels respectful. The difference lies not in you, but in their readiness. At an inner level, You may begin to sense the emergence of a personal myth, not a story you tell others, but a narrative that organizes your experience from within. You see patterns in your past with new eyes. The early sensitivity, the chronic giving, the exhaustion, the turning inward, these no longer feel random or tragic. They reveal a trajectory. You were shaped by circumstances that demanded empathy before identity. Now identity claims its due. This recognition often brings a quiet compassion for your former self, not pity, but understanding. You see how necessary those adaptations once were. You stop shaming yourself for having survived the way you did. This self-forgiveness is not sentimental. It is factual. It acknowledges reality as it was, without rewriting it to suit a moral fantasy. Dreams at this stage may feature integration rather than separation. The locked rooms open, but selectively. The solitary landscapes now include structures, pathways, signs of habitation. You are no longer wandering, you are orienting. The psyche signals that isolation has served its purpose. Connection is possible again, but only on terms that do not violate the inner axis. You may also dream of teaching, guiding, or standing quietly while others struggle nearby. These images do not imply superiority. They reflect a shift from participant to witness, from entanglement to orientation. You are no longer inside the chaos. You are adjacent to it, grounded in yourself. It is important to understand that becoming unreachable was never the final goal. It was a corrective phase. The psyche withdrew access so that something essential could be formed without interference. Now that formation has occurred, you carry yourself differently. You no longer require constant affirmation to exist. You no longer dissolve in the presence of need. This is when genuine choice becomes possible. You choose when to engage. You choose how deeply. You choose whom to allow close. These choices are not strategic. They are organic. They arise from resonance, not obligation. And because they are chosen, they carry energy rather than draining it. The world responds accordingly. You may find that fewer people approach you, but those who do are different in quality. They do not demand your availability, they respect it. They do not feed on your empathy, they meet it with their own. Such relationships feel quieter, slower, and more real. There is less urgency, less drama, and more space. This is the paradox of the empath's unreachability. By becoming less available, you become more authentic, and authenticity is what truly connects. At the deepest level, this entire process serves one aim: the alignment of ego with self. The empath who was once dispersed across others has gathered themselves into a center. From that center, life can be lived rather than managed. Love can be offered rather than extracted. Presence can be shared without self-erasure. You will still feel, you will still care, but you will no longer disappear in order to do so. And when others say, "You seem different," they are finally telling the truth. You are no longer reachable in the way you once were, because you are finally reachable to yourself